Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on a recent book by Joseph Sassoon of Georgetown University titled The Sassoons, The Great Global Merchants and the Making of an Empire, published last October by Pantheon. Our discussant this afternoon is Rebecca Coburn of Columbia University. I'm Eric Arnesen from the George Washington University. I co-chair the Washington History Seminar along with Christian Ostermann of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association that's focused on new scholarship for over the past decade. Just a few things of business before we get going. You should take note. The next seminar will take place in 1 week's time on Monday, May 15th, when we return to discuss Chad Williams' recent book, The Wounded World, W.E.B. Du Bois and the First World War, with discussants David Blight and Michelle Moyd. Second, we always like to recognize several people whose behind-the-scenes efforts make these seminars possible. Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Weekly of the American Historical Association. On the logistics front, please note that today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And finally, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function, in which case we will call on you and you will unmute yourself, or you can use the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll call on as many folks as we can. With those preliminaries out of the way, we can get the seminar fully underway. Christian is our moderator this afternoon. Christian, the screen is all yours.
Thanks, Eric. Warm welcome to everyone from me as well. I'm delighted to introduce our featured speaker this afternoon, Professor Joseph Sassoon. He is the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and professor of history and political economy at Georgetown University. He holds the Al-Sabah Chair in Politics and Political Economy of the Arab World. He's also a senior associate member of St. Anthony's College, Oxford. In 2013, his book, Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, Inside an Authoritarian Regime, published by Cambridge in 2012, and I think worked on at the Wilson Center, won the prestigious British Kuwait Prize for the best book on the Middle East. Sassoon completed his PhD at St. Anthony's. He's published extensively on Iraq and its economy and on the Middle East. The Sassoons, The Great Global Merchants and the Making of an Empire is his fifth book. Joseph, warm welcome to the Washington History Seminar, and the Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Eric, and look forward, Rebecca, to our discussion. Let me just quickly share my screen. For several generations, the Sassoon family held a prominent leadership role in Baghdad's 2,500-old Jewish community because of their connection to the rulers of the Ottoman Empire. In 1781, the scion of the family, Sheikh Sassoon bin Saleh Sassoon, born in 1750, who was the president of the Jewish community, became the chief treasurer for the Baghdad province, which was at the time a flourishing gateway city, and one of his duties was collecting taxes for the Sultan. Conflict with the governor in Baghdad led to his abrupt departure from the city with his oldest son in late 1829. His other children stayed behind in Baghdad. He died in exile in the Persian Gulf port of Bushehr in Persia a year later. Many reports and stories that circulated later ascribed the escape to anti-Semitism, but that is totally unfounded, and the fact that the rest of the family stayed behind proves this was due to a conflict with a corrupt governor. So this is the founder, David Sassoon. After the death of his father, David Sassoon, who was born in 1792, became head of the family. He moved to Bombay sometime in 1831 or late 1830 after learning of commercial opportunities in the British colonies. With no experience in trading, David benefits from two intangible assets: the family's extensive contacts in the Gulf and Persia as a result of their treasury role, and their good reputation among the merchant families in the region. Furthermore, his knowledge of languages and economies made his business one of the largest in India a couple of decades later. Family was of immense importance to David Sassoon. His first wife died at a young age in Baghdad after bearing him two sons and two daughters. His second wife, who outlived him, gave birth to 6 sons and 4 daughters. This small army of 14 children was critical in building the dynasty, and many competitors in India ascribed the success to this close and reliable network of family members. The sons were trained in business from their youth and were later sent to different locations, such as Baghdad, to meet other traders, learn Arabic, and gain experience. David realized at an early stage that the fate and success of the family had to be tied to the British Empire, and hence the firm of David Sassoon began a long connection serving British colonial economic and political interest in the different locations where they had branched out. Although he neither set foot in Britain nor spoke English, David Sassoon was granted British citizenship in recognition of his services to expanding the colonial interest of the British Empire. Just very briefly, let me show you the main characters in the book. Apart from David Sassoon, his oldest son, Abdullah, and as you see, the vast majority of the family anglicized their names at one point or another. His second, Elias. One of the most wonderful things in the book is the discovery that there was a woman, a CEO of a global trading firm at the end of the 19th century. And much later on, Victor Sassoon, who was the great-grandson of Elias, and I will come back to that. As members of the family were posted in different countries and ports, a vast correspondence took place on a daily basis between the branches and the brothers. The family seems to have kept every scrap of paper. Their archives stretch for more than 100 years, and they engaged in copious correspondence, both for business and for social matter. This is a typical correspondence. This is written in Baghdadi Jewish dialect, which means it's the language of the community in Baghdad. It's Arabic, but it's written in Hebrew letters. Unless you have those 3 components, you really cannot decode these archives. This is also typical in the sense of every part of the page was taken. The beginning is very formal, the end is very formal, but the correspondence jumps from one subject to another almost with no rhyme or reason. I put it in English with paragraphs, but that should not mislead us. This actually is really important because while this language became a coded language that prevented agents and messengers from selling the information, which was very natural at the time, given the long distances that these messengers had to cross oceans in order to fulfill their jobs. But I argue also that it backfired later on with the expansion of the firm, as this pool of talent was restricted to the Baghdadi Jewish community, as they could not hire from other places because they insisted on this correspondence. The expansion also led to increase in setting many branches and local posts, as each branch was called, for example, the House of Bombay, the House of Shanghai, the House of Japan, and so on and so forth. This map gives you a very good idea of this expansion. As you could see, the vast majority of The branches are around port cities. Three main hubs. These are the Red Stars. The first hub was Bombay, followed by Shanghai, and then in the late 1870s, London becomes another hub. Let me now shift to their trade. Two commodities changed Bombay financially and led to the rise of new global merchants such as the Sassoons, cotton and opium. Though David Sassoon was not involved in those commodities initially, and his name is actually not mentioned in the archives or any local newspapers throughout the 1830s and early 40s, David Sassoon's rise to be among the top businessmen of Bombay was slow and gradual. There was not a one event or trade that changed the picture radically. David was convinced, for example, to enter the cotton market by witnessing the surge in demand for Indian cotton after the panic caused by the failure of the American crop in the late 1850s. The outbreak of the American Civil War and consequent collapse of American exports of cotton provoked skyrocketing prices and a frenzy of speculation. Cotton shipments changed hands many times between speculators before delivered to factories, and with each exchange, a small profit could be made. The value of cotton quadrupled more than quadrupled in the first 2 years of the American Civil War, pushing Indian peasants to increase their production. There was even rumors that people were tearing apart their mattresses and selling the cotton. Before long, however, there were signs that the market was losing steam and too many traders had too much stock. The explosive growth of cotton in India had been matched in other countries such as Egypt and Brazil, and global oversupply became a major concern. By April 1865, reports circulated that cotton traders were experiencing big losses, and reports carried details of a Bombay devastated financially, with estimates of 80% of traders near bankruptcy. The violent swings in cotton prices illustrates how global merchants conducted their business in the mid-19th century without a fast communication system. As Sven Beckert observed, the global cotton trade, quote, rested on credit, credit rested on trust, trust in a global market extended well beyond the kin of any family or tribe. It rested on information. Information was accordingly at the core of most merchants' activities, end of quote. And of course, as I said, David Sassoon had that, figured out because of the so many branches. Also, David Sassoon was the first among all the merchant families in Bombay to send a son in the mid-1850s to London, and that way he had better information when the American Civil War broke out. Volatile times needed nerves of steel and experience, and what is remarkable was the young age of most of the Sassoon sons sent to all corners of Asia to run the business. Let me turn to the second commodity, opium. There is no doubt that British imperialism and colonial interest forced China to purchase opium. The Sassoon probably began trading in the mid-1840s and stopped only after the First World War. Initially, they were very small players in comparison to Indian traders or British firms such as Jardine Matheson, and only later the Sassoons became a significant part of the trade. While opium had been used for thousands of years in India and China, both for medical and recreational use, the British victory in the two opium wars in the mid-19th century opened the door to the export of large quantities of Indian opium to China, and most importantly, made it a legal product. This became an integral part of a triangle trade. British people had become addicted by then to tea and developed a taste for Chinese silk, but then India had nothing to export to China in return. Opium filled the gap and for decades made up roughly 16% of India's revenue. It actually became the world's most valuable traded commodities in the 1860s and remained so for a quarter of a century. In the words of one Indian scholar, Bombay became a great commercial and industrial center thanks to the opium business. By the 1850s, opium became an integral part in the family's trading business. The Sassoon adopted different strategies to gain a bigger share of the trade. Traders, whether of opium or cotton, preferred to deal with the Sassoon because of their willingness to pay up to 50% of the value of the merchandise. Furthermore, the family worked very hard to maintain its relationship with its partners, be it agents or merchants across the globe. Actually, conducting business in China was much more cumbersome than in India for many reasons. The currency trading was not straightforward. The use of agents called compradors complicated matters even worse. The opium trade began to weaken in the 1890s due to international and regional factors. Opium is a case study of how interrelated business and politics were during the global expansions. It was also intertwined with the British ideology of a free trade and colonial policy. Faced by political agitation, the British government did what governments do best when tough decisions need to be made. It formed a commission of inquiry to study the subject in detail, thereby delaying the need for immediate action. In 1893, a Royal Commission on Opium was created by the British Parliament with a mandate to study whether the cultivation and sale of poppy should be prohibited except for medical purposes, and the cost for Indian cultivators if opium were to be prohibited. The commission collected an incredible amount of data and gathered witness responses from a large array of individuals, including more than 100 medical experts in many locations. The finished report comprised 7 volumes, a total of 2,500 pages, and it is one of the most prized sources on opium in all its features during the 19th century. In its report, the commission reached the following conclusion, and allow me to quote. As the result of the searching inquiry, and upon a deliberate review of the copious evidence submitted to us, we feel bound to express our conviction that the movement in England in favor of active interference on the part of the Parliament for the suppression of the opium habit in India has proceeded from an exaggerated impression as to the nature and extent of the evil to be controlled. The gloomy descriptions presented to British audiences of extensive moral and physical degradation by opium have not been accepted by the witnesses representing the people of India, nor by those responsible for the government of this country. End of quote. This was an incredible conclusion. Effectively, the Commission's report removed the opium question from the British public agenda for another 15 years. And the view of the government of India prevailed, obviously, for financial reasons. In spite of the stigma attached to the trade and the growing opposition in the second half of the 19th century, the traders, including the Sassoons, continued to defend the trade and attempt to put a hold to restriction imposed by China. Apart from opium and cotton, the other main commodities traded by the Sassoons were tea, silk, indigo, rice, and pearls. The Sassoons were very cautious before embarking on trading in a new commodity. They researched the subject thoroughly and analyzed the risks and rewards. The family did not engage in money lending. They invested in banks around the globe to gain information and credit if needed. Among the banks they invested in and sat on their boards were the Bank of Hindustan, the National Bank of China, which was a serious and prestigious institution, the Imperial Bank of Persia, which added to their trade with Persia and strengthened their relationship with the Shah of Iran. But the bank that lay at the heart of the Sassoon enterprise was the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, with which they had a long and deep relationship. The family was fortunate to have other major factors working in its favor. Global commodity prices began to boom in the second part of the 19th century as industrialization and economic growth were taking place in the major economies of the world. The British ideology emphasizing free trade guided the government policies worldwide and facilitated the operations of global trading families such as the Sassoons. From 1864 onward, the impact of the telegraph radically affected global trade as branches began communicating efficiently the prices of commodities and major news items. And lastly, the development of transport within and outside India led to a reduction in the cost of trade, and of course, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 reduced it even further. One point that is really worth mentioning, and that is philanthropy. An important tenet that characterized the Sassoons was their philanthropy. In a truly innovative method, they charge a philanthropy tax on every trade they did as a cost. And I highlighted those in the yellow at the bottom of every trade. So for example, you see a chest of tea, the cost, maritime taxes, maritime insurance, and then in the last, always 1/4% of what they called in the book as tzedakah or mitzvah, i.e. charity, for each transaction, irrelevant of whether the trade was profitable or not. Now, 1/4% doesn't seem a lot, but if you're doing hundreds and hundreds of trades a year, it accumulates. As a result, local Jewish communities benefited from the philanthropy, as did the poor and young in cities such as Bombay. But also, they were not willing to donate money to any cause unless it was in cities they lived in or worked. Just here quickly, this is today still exists in the heart of Mumbai, the Sassoon Library. It started as an institute, then moved to become a think tank, and now it functions as a local library. And you can see the statue of David Sassoon at the entrance of the library. Let me come towards the summarizing. Let me sum up the main factors for the rise of the dynasty. So the reputation was really, truly critical. David Sassoon hammered in his children that you can lose in investments, but you cannot lose your reputation. And that really helped them dramatically over the decades. As I mentioned in the beginning, information system, because of the family network, but also later on of developing agents, merchants, counterparts that are reliable. Coded language, I mentioned, and taking advantage of arbitrage opportunities as the world was becoming more globalized, more opportunities arose everywhere around the world. And so by the end of 19th century, we see arbitrage between Mexican silver and Chinese silver, for example. Again, I mentioned that David Sassoon from the beginning decided to throw the lot of the family with the British, and that continued throughout the generations. Wherever they went and wherever they lived, they cultivated officialdom. They knew how to host big parties, and that strengthened their positions. And of course, the charities and the local culture aided them in that taking over and reaching that level. And finally, a lot of things were changing in the mid-19th century. Trade ideology, global wars were going on, and new trade agreements were taking place. Let me shift in the last few minutes to the decline. So the first fracture to the rise of the dynasty began when the founder, David Sassoon, died in 1864. The death shook the family. His appointment of his elder son, Abdullah, to head the business was unequivocal. The second brother, Elias, felt aggrieved. After all, he was the one who opened China and the opium trade, and he felt he was bringing more profits to the family than any other brother. Obviously, David's wish of staying a united family was utterly disregarded. After the founder deaths, it took 3 painful years of family discord and conflict before the business was formally divided. And from 1867, we have 2 competing firms, both carrying the name Sassoon, David Sassoon and Co., Edie Sassoon and Co. The rift between Abdullah and Elias pushed both sides to take more risk and expand, but both Sassoon companies wanted to enter the new market and expand into new locations. However, that rift also weakened them in the long run. One important development that took place few years after the death of David Sassoon is that Abdullah became knighted and became known as Sir Albert, and thus began the move to London and to Britain, and that became a very, very important aspect of the decline. The Sassoons' decline also took place in 1937 as Japan invaded Shanghai, and that marked a major shift in the fortunes of the dynasty. The family's wealth declined with every generation due to either lack of business talent or lack of interest in trade. The demise of the family business is not just a social phenomenon. It is the story of one of the first globalized firms that suffered the consequences of rejecting modernization and the changing times. And here is the incredible paradox. The rise of the Sassoons in the mid-19th century came from their ability to adapt to major political and technological changes. But it was their failure to do so afterwards that brought their decline, as they could not properly assess the both political, economic, and social changes that were sweeping Asia and the world at large. So let me just summarize quickly the number of factors that led to the demise. First, as I said, by the third generation, building a fortune was no longer the most important priority. Many members of the family shunned the business world and chose professions that were totally outside. In the characters of the book, there is the famous World War I poet Siegfried Sassoon. There is Rachel Beer Sassoon, who was the editor of a national newspaper in Britain, but yet talent is there, but not in business. Second, those who were in charge of the business simply did not have the same drive and willingness to work hard. Members of the family were huge spenders as they felt enormous pressure to be part of the high society in England, which looked down on people who had to work to earn their income. Third was the inability to deal with major changes, such as the communist takeover of China. The family was close to the regime of Chiang Kai-shek and suffered huge losses as their assets in real estate were nationalized and their business disappeared. Fourth, the family failed to diversify into other industries, opting instead for more secure and less risky assets. And so even when they stopped from commodity, they headed to real estate rather than to industry. Finally, the adage that fortunes are mostly made and lost in 3 generations held absolutely true. The family branched out, considerable fortunes and estates were split and further split with each generation. And without any dynamic revival of the business, the end of the family fortune and power became a foregone conclusion. Even though one part of the family, Edie Sassoon, under the leadership of Victor Sassoon, prospered, Victor Sassoon also made the critical step of leaving India in 1926, as he believed China was more liberal in its attitudes to foreigners and foreign investments. Obviously, that decision would prove disastrous. As Victor himself put it, and I quote, "I gave up India and China gave me up." Finally, even after World War II, there were opportunities that he could seize, given the fact that his company had a stronghold in Hong Kong, but he chose to liquidate whatever he could at a very cheap prices and head to the Bahamas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. It is now my privilege to introduce Dr. Rebecca Kobrin. She will provide some comments and then launch us into a conversation with Joseph that I hope many of you in the audience will be able to join as well. Dr. Coburn is the Russell and Bettina Knapp Associate Professor of American Jewish History at Columbia University, where she's also the co-director of Columbia's Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies. She works in the fields of immigration history, urban studies, and Jewish history, specializing in modern Jewish migration. Her book, Jewish Bialystok and its Diaspora, published by Indiana in 2010, was awarded the Jordan Schnitzer Prize for Best Book in Modern Jewish History concerning the Americas. She's the editor of Chosen Capital, The Jewish Encounter with American Capitalism, published by Rutgers in 2012. Salo Baron, Using the Past to Shape the Future of Jewish Studies in America, published by Columbia just last year. And she's co-editor with Adam Teller of Purchasing Power, The Economics of Jewish History. Her writing has appeared in the Washington Post, CNN, and many other outlets. Welcome to the Washington History Seminar, Rebecca. The Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And can I have a request? Can you have both my head and Joseph's head? And Joseph, can you leave the picture on the PowerPoint of the family, of the stars of your book up? Because I think that will be good as I ask you questions. Is that possible?
Sure, but I will have to share the screen.
Yeah, you can share. And I'm wondering, can you put both of our faces? So while we're doing this, I just want to say to everyone, for those who came late, and it's wonderful to see 150 people on this beautiful day in this Zoom room, please put your questions in the Q&A, because I have my questions, but I have already seen there are excellent questions. And I think it's a fascinating topic that I hope we will have time to all talk about. And I know that as many questions as possible will be addressed. So I'm going to just get started. Christian, can you put my box, or is that impossible?
I'll have to ask our producers, can we do this?
Okay, well, if not, you can just take it down then, and I'll figure out. I just want people to remember the picture of the family. Can you get to the family, Joseph, just for a minute?
Sure.
Yes. All right. So I want everyone to focus on this, just in case we can't get all of us on the screen, this picture. So As you heard, I am not an expert in Baghdadi Judeo-Arabic, nor am I an expert on understanding trade in China and India, but I have written a lot on Jews and business in the United States, in particular thinking about failed Jewish family businesses. Because when all the dust settled after Lehman Brothers officially filed in 2008, most people actually forgot that it began as a family business in Plantation, Alabama, 160 years earlier, and how it began in dry goods, then went to cotton futures before it went to finance. But Lehman Brothers in many ways exemplified how a Jewish family and its business shaped American finance and also were shaped by America. And in many ways, the book that is at the center of what we're talking about today is similar in many ways because it is a cautionary tale, not celebratory, in its epic saga of the rise and fall of the Sassoon family business. And I would say its Jewishness, which began in Baghdad and then spread throughout India, China, Asia, to England, and traded at their height in, as we heard about, opium, tea, cotton, silk, jewels. And indeed, it is a tale similar to what I said of how one Jewish family and their business shaped the British Empire and were shaped by the British Empire. And I just want to say it is a wonderful and gripping family drama in which women are shut out of certain roles, which we'll talk about. Sons spar, children rebel, patriarchal fathers have control, then lose control. And in many ways, it's an amazing read. And Joseph, as he just shared with us, charts this family's triumphs and tragedies across continents and centuries. The book opens in the 18th century in Iraq and then follows at least 6 generations. And I commend Joseph. So this is where Jewish history is important. Baghdadi Jewish community, like all non-Ashkenazi, name your name after the living. So many people have the same name. So without the wonderful family tree in the beginning, you'd often get lost. As he talks about how over the generations, the family became less Jewish and less wealthy. And indeed, this is the first question I want you to reflect on: the relationship between the downward decline of their Jewishness and their wealth. And you spoke a little bit in the end about it, about how you saw them not working as hard, but it is this tale that as they became more British, the business faltered and they became less wealthy. So I'm going to open, I just want to say one more thing, and then I'm going to want you to return to that question, because I think what I want everyone here to be thinking about and what I'm focusing my questions on and why I wanted this picture up is that the book is the tale of David Sassoon and the generations that came after him. And it focuses on the ruin, but what is really the most interesting about this book, and I hope we all can focus on today, is this issue of what is a family dynasty, what is a successful family dynasty, and what can thinking about family dynasties and their businesses teach us about family as a heuristic, as a category of analysis in the study of history, and in particular in the study of business and empire. Because families have long been mythologized as entities, but clearly understanding families and family dynamics is crucial for this book. But it's also crucial when thinking about business history, because I think in many ways, many of the businesses that we have today start in families. They often don't end, but thinking about what families add to thinking about business. And the reason I was thinking about empire, I don't know how you can do the day after a coronation, not think about family and empire, particularly the British Empire. So this is a rich book that covers many things, but I'm going to focus on this question. What does thinking about families make us think anew about Jewish history, about imperial history, in particular the history of the British Empire, and about business history? So I start with that. And Joseph, I want you to just talk about a little bit, the end of the book is a very cautionary tale. And I'm gonna read a quotation from the end of the book in which you quote another legendary Jewish family. And this is the quote from the book. It's from page 301. Another more recent magnate, Sir Michael Kaduri, summed up why families such as his succeeded. Quote, "It is about obligations, not just privileges. Leading by example is the only way to keep a family business going from one generation to the other." End quote from Michael Kaduri. Then Joseph continues, "The Sassoons partially failed to do so in the second generation and utterly bungled it in the third and fourth generation. Dynasties are, of course, more enduring than any one individual, but their survival is dependent on their leaders' ability to instill resilience and the capacity to adapt to changing circumstances in their organization. In the case of the Sassoons, this leadership failed." End quote. So, Joseph, I just want you to reflect a little bit on this notion of how the patriarch of the family, and I want to just say it is a patriarchal family who he sends his sons all over the world and they listen and go where he wants, how he failed in his leadership to instill two things, both business and a commitment to Jewishness, and what you see the relationship and what he would make of his family and the business, and just to reflect on these interconnected questions of what David Sassoon would make of the long trajectory of his family.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. So what you're mentioning about the role of family businesses is really critical. And I'm actually just finished this week teaching a seminar of history of family businesses across the globe. One of the things that you really come to realize, wherever they were, and the 10 cases we took literally from every continent and throughout different periods, the founder has this issue to deal with. How can you transfer it to the next generation? It doesn't matter what business it is, trading, non-trading, manufacturing, as long as the business is success, the question arises, how do you pass it to the next generation? And different families adopted different methods. You're absolutely correct. David Sassoon thought by educating his children to the best of a British education, but also Jewish education, he has both things ironed out and firm. Obviously, he can't control it beyond the immediate time, but what he made the critical mistake is two things. One, appointing the oldest son, which I don't know, but from the archives and the correspondence between the two brothers, I come to the conclusion that at no point did the father sit with the two sons and say, hey, I decided on Abdullah taking over. At no point he also spoke to Elias to tell him that I have decided, I know you have worked hard, I know you brought a lot of profits, but I want to continue the tradition of the oldest son taking over. I think that was a disastrous mistake that the family paid for it for a long time. And it's fascinating. You see it in different countries, in different continents. That mistake is literally like the will has a bomb that explodes when the will is open and the family is torn. Abdullah never spoke or exchanged a word with his brother Elias until both of them died. And only Flora later on tried to reconnect the two parts of the family. But from a business point of view, it was really almost too late. I like what you said, that the family changed Britain and Britain changed them. I think they really had a huge influence, both from a business point of view, but other aspects. You know, one of the descendants is Philip Sassoon, Sir Philip Sassoon, who was a major art connoisseur. You could see actually in the Jewish Museum in New York, there is an exhibition of the Sassoons. There are a lot of his paintings or paintings he commissioned. And that really, had a very important impact on British society. And as I mentioned before, there is the famous poet of World War I, or the first woman who was an editor of a national newspaper long before British women could vote in Britain. And yet, it's not enough to have the talent. And another thing that took place, which is really every generation produced less children. So Victor Sassoon died without children. Philip Sassoon died without children. So the fact that, David obviously went to the extreme of having 14 who survived, but by each generation, the number reduced. And if you have one or two who are talented, but not talented in business, that side of the family from a business point of view is doomed. And this is really an important thing. And again, it's applicable to all families and all businesses throughout generation. The other last point I want to touch on is this identity. I mean, Albert was not as religious as the father, but there was never a doubt in his mind that he is an Arab Jew, that he is a Baghdadi and Jewish, happens to be very British at the end of his life, and he became even a baron after becoming knighted as Sir Albert. Towards 2 years before his death, he became a baron. But that didn't change how he felt about who he is. That is not true about the others. Now, you can argue, what is the connection between that and business? Well, I think there is a connection, because the deeper they dug in to become part of the aristocracy, and I talked about it very briefly, in the 19th century, British upper aristocracy were not supposed to work. And by the way, that continued even after World War II. So the sense of, there is a wonderful letter in the archives of two members of the family in London, by then very British. They wrote that we went to the office at 11 o'clock in the morning. At 1 o'clock, we went to the club, and 3 o'clock, we headed to the horse racing to bet on horses. Now think about this versus David Sassoon or Abdullah Sassoon or Elias Sassoon, who worked 6 days a week, 14 hours, spent every day in addition to that 2 hours, 3 hours on correspondence, versus the third and fourth generation. And so the loss is not about religiosity. The loss was really more about this identity of being Baghdadis into the new identity of trying desperately to be accepted as British aristocracy. Had they succeeded in being part of it? Overall, I think you could say, yes, they succeeded in becoming part of the aristocracy. The price was very heavy from a business point of view. And in the book, I also compare that to the Lehman Brothers first generations versus fourth generation.
Great. Thank you so much. So you know what? Maybe we'll just stop the screen share so we can have a virtual conversation Thank you. So I want to now just thank you. That was a great, just introduction to understanding overall the different paradigms that you're dealing with and what success and failure and rise and decline. So from the vantage point of Jewish history, and this is what I find fascinating about the book, it's a global empire built on a very local identity. In particular, the local dialect is so central to the business's success because they can convey information without anyone knowing what they're conveying, even though they're not written. So I want you to think with us about this vantage point from Jewish history, which Salo Baron, who's the head of Jewish, created Jewish history in the United States, basically said you can never write about Jews without thinking about the whole world. But your book raises how local is probably just as important about thinking about global. So I want you to think about, through the Sassoons, this relationship, because everyone's talking about globalization, global business. Where does local fit, both from this, dialect, but also what you touched upon they are very invested in the local community through charity and philanthropy. So if you could just talk about that for 1 minute.
Yeah, I think it's really an important point. And I think part of their success is due to their integration wherever they went. I mean, whether it's Burma, whether it's Japan, whether it's Shanghai, whether it's Bombay, and then later on in London. And quickly, I pointed out when I was showing about the philanthropy, they really refused as a policy to give money to places that they were not part of it, because they wanted, wherever they are, the locals, be it Jews or non-Jews, to benefit. I mean, there is a wonderful, huge hospital today in Pune, which is about 4 or 5 hours from Mumbai. It's still called the Sassoon Hospital. It's fascinating. David Sassoon began that when he moved to Pune because it has less humidity and the weather is better than Bombay. One of the first things he declared about the hospital should never turn away any citizens of Pune because of religion or sect. That he didn't want it to be just for Jews or for the Hindus. Everyone it was open. And when you were thinking about 1860, 1861, this was really incredible because in Bombay itself, they opened the first hotel at the time. And the first thing they did, that only Europeans are allowed into the hotel, and that families like the Sassoons or the Tatas are not allowed to enter into the hotel, versus his declaration that the hospital should treat everyone irrelevant. So I think the locality is very, very important. They really believed in it. Floods in China, they immediately donated money to that, and same in other places. The reverse of that, for example, and that question comes up in some of these presentations, they did not give money to Zionist causes or Zionism because they were not operating there, and they did not see it as serving their communities, be it workers or others.
Thank you. So before we get to everyone's, I have one last question, because you've sort of alluded to it, and then you just said you taught a course, right, on family businesses. So I want you to reflect a little bit on a question I'm always asked using the Sassoons. Do Jewish family businesses operate differently? Or to think more broadly, right, how and why do certain family businesses take off and endure across centuries? What can the analysis of, like what you did, of Jewish families and their businesses teach us in economic history? Or might we just say, to put it most bluntly, is there something distinctive about how Jewish families operate and their firm and the Sassoon family that made it endure for at least 2 centuries and then decline? And, this general question about Jews and their business practices and how this one family helps us think about the development of the British Empire and its system of capitalism. So I want you just to reflect on, because it seems like, if someone read this book and goes, I want to build an enduring family dynasty, well, I guess I should have 14 children. I should communicate what you've said so far, openly, very, very clearly with who I want to succeed me, which is the whole theme of succession, right? So thinking through, this is what I'm asking, what other lessons for like the business world today can your case study show us? But I want you to think more broadly, because Jews have long been constructed as Jewish business families. And do they really operate differently than other family businesses? What do they do? Or is it just, that all family businesses operate similarly? Or is there something distinctive about Jews? That's my question.
Sure. I personally don't think they were different. I think the challenges facing families across the board, irrelevant of religion or nationality, are the same. Literally, we discussed families from the Philippines to Turkey to India to Britain to France to the US, and they had the same issues. The issues is a founder versus children. Sometimes there is a rivalry. A sibling rivalry is the same wherever you went, and whatever period you're talking about. Do you integrate outsiders? And if so, when you're really deep in the family or when you pull out? Fascinatingly enough, for example, the Sassoons did not bring outsiders when there was a need for outsiders. When did they bring outsiders? When it was almost too late and they were not as engaged in the business. There is like 10, 15 challenges. Whether you're talking about a 2023 or 1923 or 1823, I believe it's really the same. Information, network. Yes, we have vast information and vast amount of information, but we all sometimes get the same information. Why does A and B are more successful in getting this information and turning it to gold, while the other 100 who had the same kind of information didn't benefit from it? So I think overall, to be honest, I think that the challenges that face family businesses are very, very much similar. I looked at Indian families, at Parsi families, at Muslim families like the Koch. Same issues. Who do I pass the mantle to? What is the relationship going to be with the siblings? Should I bring in outsiders? The role of philanthropy is actually in all of those cases play a role. Different families shifted it in different. Some concentrated on politics, others did not. But I think these challenges are really quite similar.
Can I just add one more last question? So, I mean, you alluded to it about Farha. I'm thinking about the story you tell in the book, which you can also share, about how she is clearly skilled at business and then she is shut out of the business because of patriarchy, basically. So is that something you think is important for us to understanding business today?
Yeah,
through women as silent partners, and when they are actually given a voice, then they're shut down. Thinking through what that has to teach us for today.
I think, things have improved, but have they reached the right level? I don't think so. I think there is still that issue at play. But of course, towards the 19th century, it was much worse, because whether in India or in Britain, it was very, very unusual. And there were a lot of matriarchs around the world, America, Europe, Asia, but they didn't have a CEO, a woman CEO running a global business. And in the book, there is a whole chapter about all the conspiracies against her, not because she didn't succeed. And that is the tragedy. It's the exact opposite. The conspiracy intensified as she became more successful, more innovative, more daring in changing things. And the men in the family did not like it. And frankly, as I wrote, that the side of the David Sassoon pushing Flora out of business in 1901 was the beginning of the end of that side of the family. The Edie Sassoon had a different trajectory, and with the rise of Victor Sassoon, had more glorified decades later on, at least from 1826 until World War II, from 1926 until World War II. But I think it is really an issue that here there was a chance that this woman could have turned David Sassoon and co. and continued to bring it to a more prosperous, but that did not happen, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for this. I think.
Yes, and thank you, Rebecca, for your thoughtful questions and comments, and Joseph for responding. We'd like to bring others now into the conversation, and you can do so in two ways. Our actually preferred way for you to interject yourself is to use the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality, and you'll get queued and I'll call on you. Or you can post your comments, as some of you have done, to the Q&A function of Zoom. Perhaps let me start, as I encourage others to use the raise hand function. Let me start, though, with a question from Shuang Wen, who teaches modern Chinese and Arab histories at NYU Shanghai, and asks, I understand that despite having a long presence in Shanghai and Hong Kong, the Sassoons always projected themselves as Britons among the local communities and did not assimilate into the Chinese culture. I'm curious to know if the Sassoons adapted to the local culture in Bombay in the early years of migration out of Baghdad. Joseph? And, Rebecca, feel free at any point you'd like to chime in, please do so. Joseph.
Yeah, I think this is a very good, important point, actually. One of the fascinating things is really they did not learn Chinese. They did learn Hindustani. I think they're mixed much more in India and other countries than in China. Part of that, I think the way the system was set up in China with these compradors, some Baghdadi Jews actually did adopt the Sassoons, because they kept going back to Baghdad and hiring these people. They attracted a lot of young, talented people to come to India to work for them. Among them, the Kaduris, who spun off 7 years later and started a business. But there is another one, his name is Hardoon, who also came from Baghdad, worked for the Sassoon in China, and actually left the Sassoon, married a Chinese woman, adopted Buddhism, learned the language, and died as probably one of the richest men in Asia at the time, and has a fascinating story about himself. But you're correct, there was less intermingling with the Chinese locals than in other locations.
Thank you. Dane Kennedy, would you please unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Sassoon, for a fascinating talk and what sounds to be really a remarkable book about a remarkable family. One of the points you made was that one reason for the decline of the Sassoons, as I understood your remarks, was in effect because they became increasingly anglicized. That is, they like to go to the races, to the club, and things of this sort. And one can certainly see how that might impact the business in an adverse way. On the other hand, they're operating within the British imperial world. And anglicizing the family is, in some sense, surely a business decision that is advantageous. And I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more about how you weigh the costs and benefits of this need to fight by the Sassoons to make these personal connections to British culture and British power. Thank you.
Thank you. You bring up an important point, but I think they almost took it to the extreme in this identification with the British aristocracy. Part of the problem really begins in India, where they established contact with the Prince of Wales. And from that point of view, there was almost a desperate need to be among those. I agree with you that it served their purpose, but I think it could have been part of Britain and even part of maybe the upper class, but not to this extent. Hunting, shooting, estates. And it is really, and I quote a couple of academic sources to describe Britain at the time. I mean, it was really a no-no that you work in Britain. That is just unacceptable. So if you want to be part of this club, well, you can't work. So all these connections are great, but frankly, it's useless if you're refusing to engage in work and only spend huge amounts because you had to have the houses in London and in Brighton and in Scotland. There were estates. And by the way, one of the most fascinating things that I wrote in the book about where did the money go? When David Sassoon died, he left almost the equivalent of $5 billion today. And you could think, how could you lose that much money? And also, Victor tripled his money in the first 10 years in Shanghai as the prices of real estate skyrocketed. Well, it's very simple. They were barely working. The British tax took about 45-50%. The rest got divided between the children. None of the children could afford to buy out the real estate, the crown jewels, wherever in London or Scotland. So that had to be sold. And all you need, if you think about, 1x becoming half an x after taxes, divided by 5, each one gets 12.5%. And then if you think of these having 3 children, it really, within 3 generations, it almost disappear into zero or almost zero. And that's how the money was lost, because there was no generational new wealth. And so the opium comes to an end. Obviously, World War I, cotton trade, China, Japan enters, and that comes to an end. The mills comes to an end, even by the 30s. And there is no replacement. Yes, real estate in Shanghai, but that is not. And David Sassoon and co, frankly, didn't even have the Sino Empire in Shanghai. So the cost was huge. Yes, they got accepted, but the cost was much more than the benefit, in my judgment.
Thank you. Avi Rosenzweig asks, did the Sassoons and other Asian cotton traders take positions on trade in slaves and the use of slaves in cotton production in the New World? how did their political and economic entanglements with Britain influence their attitudes towards the Confederacy and the Caribbean?
In the 120 years of archives, the word slavery does not come up. I have not seen any reference to it. They did not engage in any trade, neither with the United States or with any Caribbean countries, none whatsoever. During World War II, when Victor obviously could no longer be in Shanghai because of the Japanese occupation and the war, he came to the States and traveled, but frankly, not to look for business opportunity. He wanted to be a globalist in the sense of giving speeches all around the country as an expert on China and Japan. And later on, the only connection to the Caribbean is moving and living there the last few years of his life, where before his death. But there was no other connection and none whatsoever about slavery trade.
Thank you. Eric has a question. Eric?
Thank you. Now that HBO's 4 seasons of Succession are coming to an end, next week or the week after, I could easily see this becoming the next big hit. But like the Roy family, the Sassoons also have a politics, and a politics of carrying out the interests of the British Empire. And Victor in particular struck me as just a fascinating figure. And so if you could just say a bit more about his political orientation, both in India and in China. He's a critic of the Congress Party. He has no love for Gandhi. He tells the Indians, put off independence until after the Second World War. So he's quite critical there. And it's not clear to me that he had much to say about the wartime famine that was taking place there. And if you shift to China, he's friends with the nationalists. He underestimates the communists. So if you could just say something about his political orientation, I would appreciate it.
Sure, thank you. I'll start with Succession. I actually got interviewed in British newspaper and wrote an article to one of the online newspapers about Succession and where it's going to go. I might be wrong, I might be right, but I made my guess there. I will not share it with you. You're absolutely right. I think that when he took over the business in the early 1920s, he was convinced that all the strikes that are taking place in India are the result of communist agitators and activists. That is a part of, I think, and I wrote about it, of his naivete. To argue. There were real issues of labor problems that were taking place in India at the time. And yes, the Communist Party's influence was increasing, but not all the strikes and the movement of the labor was because of the communists. He left India because he really he was convinced that the communists are going to take over over India. Then when he went to China and things prospered, this died down, but then he is befriending Chiang Kai-shek and begin to see China through his vision. World War II erupts, and then he goes back to India, and there he wanted to resurrect his relationship, and he did meet with Nehru. But as I mentioned in the book, the train has left the station. By 1941, there is very clear that India is heading to independence. You could do whatever you want to do. Even in Britain itself, that there was more and more recognition that towards the end of the war, India is heading to independence. So one of the problems, and I talked about it today, is, so on one hand, they really interpreted the economic and political changes that were taking place in mid-19th century correctly, and they totally misinterpreted those events at the end towards World War I. From then on, they didn't understand that the British Empire's decline has begun after World War I. Victor definitely misunderstood and miscomprehended the rise of nationalism. This notion that he kept that even the communists, if they win and started believing that they're going to win, that they are going to be open to trade because they desperately need the West for their economies. All of those, by the way, were wrong. And to add to this list, he kept going in the United States in 1940, giving speeches. He gave a big speech to the Boston Chamber of Commerce and said, Japan will never, ever attack the United States. Well, so much for those predictions. Hopefully my prediction on succession will prove better.
Thank you. Thanks, Joseph. Joseph, could you for a moment just talk about the challenges of writing your own family's history? I mean, it was not a history you were drawn to initially or right away. So talk to us for a little bit about the challenges. And also, did you go beyond the archive, the family archive in your research?
Yeah, I mean, I correctly pointed out, and I was happily at the Woodrow Wilson working on Iraq and authoritarianism. So no, this never crossed my mind. I tell it in the book about, a total thing that out of the blue comes through to me through a letter from an other person by the name of Joseph Sassoon in Western Scotland, and then one digging after the other. But the thing that really turned it around is discovering thousands and thousands of those documents that I shared in the slides, and realizing that no one has really used them because that is history. But yes, I complemented it a lot. I worked in the Ottoman Empire archives because I wanted to really establish why they left. The Indian National Archives, the Shanghai Municipal Archives, the British Archives, of course, and a lot of newspapers from India, China, Britain, and the US. They were really amazing with the details that they provided of the trade at the time and the expansion, for example, of shipping. I did not interview people. I did not really feel it's kind directly my family. First of all, it's 200 years ago. And two, I belong to one of the, I'm a descendant of one of the siblings of David Sassoon, rather from the David Sassoon itself.
Thank you. Rebecca Moore asks, could you discuss how being Jewish informed the business ethics of the Sassoon family over time? We've talked a little bit about it, but if you could elaborate on that a little more, that'd be great.
I mean, it's interesting, and if you read the book, you see that I was very critical of the way that they didn't address the issue of the opium trade. Yes, it was legal. Yes, I know that it was quoted as no different from any other commodity like silver or gold. And also, I know that you could go to any pharmacy in New York or London or Paris and obtain it from a pharmacist. I know all this, but I think the writing was on the wall, and neither them or others, addressed it or wanted to address it. And of course, this imperial parliament report that I read you, the final conclusion, just strengthened. I think there is an important element of the ethics is really one thing that I did like a lot, that in the 100 years or more of archives, never ever the issue was raised, should we deal with A or B because of their religion or sect? The issue was always, should we trade with them? Can you trust your counterpart? And so the trust become fundamental. And if you recall, when I put the slides of the reasons for the success, the reputation was really, really critical. And the one thing that stayed generation 1, 2, 3, 4 intact is the reputation. There was never an embezzlement. There was never a case where people said that the Sassoon cheated me. I guess that's the part of ethics that did work well.
Thank you. Let me call on Nissim Rubin. Nissim Rubin, I see your note in the questions, but do you actually have a question beyond the note to Joseph? If so, now is your chance. Got to unmute yourself. You need to unmute yourself, otherwise we won't be able to hear you. Since that seems to be a problem, let me go to a question by Maureen Leschendock. What is the relationship of the family with King Faisal I of Iraq?
Nothing really in particular. If you're thinking of the first finance minister in his government of the King of Faisal, he's not a family member. His first name is Sassoon and not his last name. But the family maintained relationship with, as I said, the Shah of Iran throughout the history of the Ottoman Empire, and of course, with other leaders. But King Faisal was too late. Sir Philip Sassoon did meet with him and had tea on the veranda of his palace in 1920s when he visited Iraq at the time, which was part of the British mandate, but he visited there not as a Sassoon, but as the Deputy Secretary for the Air Force, and wrote about that. So you could say there was a connection, but not connection of business or politics.
Thank you. Barbara Grant asks, the British during the Raj looked at Jews as Orientals more similar to the peoples of South Asia and East Asia than to Northern Europeans like the British. Did this play a role in the success of the Sassoon family in the second half of the 19th century, in addition to the connections they had made during their time serving the Ottoman Sultan?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really important. It's fascinating because from the early days in India, they kept pushing the British rulers that they should not be, quote unquote, confused with the local Indians. There was a lot of racism, of course, in that, and that the Baghdadi Jews and later on the Jews from Aleppo or Jews from Alexandria who were there should be treated as Europeans and not local Indians, as there were communities of Jews in India dating back all the way to the 15th, 16th century. And they hammered that throughout the whole time. And whenever there was a new rule or regulations, even at the beginning of the 20th century, they rushed all of them to write letters. And of course, they became British citizens So it was much easier once they got that, whether David Sassoon or all his family. And by the way, there was even a deal at some point between the British and the Sassoons that any employee that comes to work for them would receive almost automatically a British citizenship. And that guaranteed that they were treated differently from the local Jewish communities.
Thank you. Robert Goller asked, and what may be the final question of the session, we'll see if we can squeeze one more in. Can you speak more about Farha's role? We touched on this already earlier, but how did she oversee activities, and what were her strengths and weaknesses in the family business?
Yeah, so Farha or Flora Sassoon is a doubly Sassoon. She is a Sassoon, was a Sassoon, but married to a Sassoon. And she began to help her husband, who was running the business. And her husband was one of the only ones of the Sassoons of David Sassoon and Co. who never went to Britain or never left India or China, stayed in the East and run that business, which was obviously critical. But 3 years before his death, she announced that she wants to be his partner. And she started going to the office 2-3 days a week, which was really in itself revolutionary, as traders who were coming to the office found it really incredible that there was a woman sitting in the office and complained, how are they going to shake hands with her? She was very innovative. And I gave a talk about only devoted to her innovation in the sense of bringing a new, risk analysis was the first time was installed. How much exposure each office should have, what currency is available or should not be dealt with. All these innovations were introduced by her to the irritations of other members of the family. What was her weakness? She was coming at a period where really the minute that Abdullah died, and because he knew her strength, she was left at the mercy of his other brothers who just saw her as irritant and wants to revolutionize the whole business and kind to block her. It is unfortunate that she lasted only 6 years and they managed to push her out. The rest is in the book.
Thank you. I'm afraid we'll have to end it here. My thanks to Rebecca and Joseph and Eric for a just really rich and fascinating conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric for final remarks.
Thank you, Christian. Please join us next week on Monday, May 15th at 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time for a discussion of Chad Williams' new book, The Wounded World, W.E.B. Du Bois and the First World War, with discussants David Blight and Michelle Moyd. Till then, stay safe, good night, and thanks.